Welcome everyone to part 3 in this little mini-series on why evolution is not social Darwinism. Here in part 3, I'll explore the emergent field of gene editing, which allows us to alter the germline of a gonadal cell, or the genome of an embryo. This has opened the door to a future with genetically modified people. The question now is, do we go through the door? What lies on the other side? If we go through and don't like what we find, can we turn back, or have we altered ourselves forever? In this episode, I'll explore the social and civilizational outcomes and consequences of genetically modifying human beings. This is how eugenics will be used in the future, with modern technology that can fix genes and screen embryos, instead of relying on gross violations of human rights. Because of this much more sophisticated approach to eugenics, the ethics of embryo modification and preferential embryo selection are much more nuanced and much less straightforward. For example, it might seem obvious that if we have the capacity to cure a genetic disease, we should. After all, what could go wrong? Well, reconsider the example of the social Darwinist leader of a sub-Saharan country, who purged everyone with mutated hemoglobin alleles. He removed an environment-specific fitness advantage that made his whole population more vulnerable to a disease, to malaria. This same principle also applies to cystic fibrosis, where a heterozygote carrier is resistant to cholera. But besides these specific diseases, there isn't too much to worry about here. A much bigger issue is the risk of altering an embryo's genome by modifying, replacing, or removing an unwanted genetic sequence. The most obvious risk is that the procedure just won't be perfect. We've learned that the CRISPR-Cas9 enzyme is pretty sloppy, it's pretty messy, and it makes a lot of unintended deletions and changes. If we try to help an embryo by removing a disease-causing mutation, but then end up causing a lot more mutations that really fuck up the embryo, the end result is the production of a stillborn, which ethically is pretty bad. Or it would be even worse if it led to the birth of a significantly deformed or diseased child, who dies after a short life full of suffering. That is basically the worst case scenario ethically. It's an ethical nightmare, and we would have brought it on ourselves by being too eager to tamper with genetics. It would seem that if you're talking about an embryo you plan to implant and bring to term, there is no ethical way to even start editing the genome in the first place, unless you can guarantee that the medical procedure will be performed perfectly. Until you know for certain that there's virtually no risk from the actual process of gene editing itself, until that happens, this is an ethical gray area. There's also the issue of consent. A living adult person can consent to genetic alterations, or gene therapies that will help with an ailment or a disease. In these people, we cannot practically change the genome in every cell in their body, so therapies usually focus on injecting small genes or plasmids, or something like that, into a localized region, where the genetic problem itself is manifesting. Essentially, the person is consenting to having their somatic cells altered, which is a genetic modification that is confined to a portion of their body. Genetic alterations to somatic cells will not be passed on to that person's offspring. However, alterations made to the genome of cells in the germline will be passed on to that person's offspring. Theoretically, this would mean that someone chose to alter the cells in their gonads. If you alter the genome of the germ cell line in your ovaries or testicles, then this will cause the germ cells there to produce eggs and sperm, respectively, that carry the altered genome. The genome alteration will be present in the gametes that engage in fertilization, and it will be present in every single cell of the new individual. The problem here is that this new individual did not give their consent to have this deliberate artificial genetic alteration. Their parents chose to get it, which inherently means that the parent has also made this decision for their unborn offspring, and for every descendant all of their offspring will ever have, forever into the future. Now, if we're talking about removing something that's obviously harmful, like a genetic disease like Huntington's disease, then the offspring might be very happy that their parents elected for this germline alteration to make sure that their children and their children's children and so on and so forth would have no trace of that genetic disease. Even though the offspring couldn't give their consent, this would be perceived as a serious medical issue where consent is assumed. But what if the parent chooses an elective genetic alteration? What if the parent doesn't like some aspect about themselves that isn't necessarily medically harmful, but is just undesirable? For example, what if a person has thin, mousy brown hair, and they hate it, and they don't want to pass it on to their kids, so they have a genetic procedure done to the germline in their gonads to implant genes for soft, thick, golden blonde hair? Now you might think, well, that's not harmful. The child isn't being hurt by it. In fact, the child is benefiting by being guaranteed a desirable physical feature. How on earth could this be a bad thing? Well, this is the famous problem of designer babies, and it's one hell of an ethical quagmire. So first, consider the natural process of reproduction. Two adults meet, they have sex, they get pregnant, and they give birth to a child. The child will have a semi-random assortment of traits based on the raw genetic contributions of both mother and father. Whichever traits the child actually has, like their mother's nose and their father's hair, depends on the randomness involved in the assortment of chromatids during meiosis. Having a kid the natural way is colloquially referred to as rolling the dice with respect to the traits from the parents that the child will manifest. Okay, now that you've considered that, now consider parents who want to modify their germline and screen their embryos and do every bit of modern eugenics that they can so as to create an optimal baby. They opt to have their subpar natural alleles removed from the gene line and replaced with designer alleles that will give the baby an artificial boost, with everything from improved intelligence, height, and physical strength to healthy psychological predispositions and emotional stability, to attractive facial features and beautiful hair. So now that we've considered both of these cases, now compare the natural baby to the designer baby. The designer baby is clearly superior in whichever metric you choose for comparison, because it was deliberately modified to be superior. The major problem here is that this will lead to genetic discrimination, where people without alterations are unable to compete with people who have designer traits. What may begin as personal discrimination, like a designer person feeling entitled and superior to natural-born people, or to everyone, including natural-born people, just finding themselves more sexually or charismatically attracted to a designer person, this can quickly escalate to financial and sociological discrimination, as all of the designer people are smarter and more confident, and will eventually saturate positions of power, influence, and wealth. The natural people will be outcompeted, and they'll be relegated to low skill, low value, and low dignity jobs that every designer person is overqualified for. So consider the social ramifications of this. Think about what will happen to a society as it progresses into the future if this kind of social stratification just gets worse and worse and worse. How long will this go on for before all of the designer people start to say, why are we putting up with all of these natural people? Why are we bothering to support them? Why don't we just get rid of them? And then you come back to the 20th century application of eugenics and all of the horrors and violence that entails. Now step back and look at the designer baby problem again with fresh eyes. If we look at it again, we can also see that it casts a really unsettling moral problem onto childbirth itself. If designer babies become a thing, and you choose not to modify your baby in preference of a natural birth and a natural child, are you committing a disservice against your own child? Are you really doing something ethical by knowingly giving birth to a child who will be outcompeted and outperformed by all of the designer children that they meet in their life? Is this fair to do to your child because of your personal desire for a, quote, natural child? Then there's the ethics of actually choosing the traits that you're going to get optimized alleles for. If you want only the best for your baby, but you have a limited amount of cash, what do you buy? What alleles do you prioritize? Do you opt for intelligence and confidence alleles? Or do you go for alleles that are linked with various physical traits and health benefits? You can start to see how this plays out kind of like a video game, like an RPG, where you're starting a new campaign, you're creating a new character, and you're spending points on your character's base stats. You can do the min-max strategy and put all of your money into intelligence, or into charisma, or heart health, or whatever trait that you think is best. Or you can do the generalist strategy and pick good alleles for a wide variety of traits and hope for a decent overall outcome. But what does this say about a society that has come to the point where treating your embryological child like an RPG character is an acceptable or even encouraged behavior? What if this society is so competitive that you, as a parent, have to play the embryo RPG to even give your kid a fighting chance? This would definitely be a case where the dream of genetically designed babies has led to a dystopian eugenicist hell. It would be a socially reinforcing runaway cycle, leading to designer baby saturation and a collapse in genetic diversity. But more on this later. Now consider a future where designer babies are affordable enough to be common for everyone. In such a future, a natural childbirth, to have a natural child, might one day carry a negative ethical connotation. If you could design your child with the best alleles that science can provide, which would then maximize their chances for a successful life, if it's within your financial ability to do so, then it could be perceived as ethically and morally wrong to deny your child that privilege, and to instead put your child at the mercy of the random assortment of your limited set of mediocre natural genes. The designer baby problem throws the entire aspect of childbirth and child rearing and parenthood into an ethical quagmire. But there's another angle to this that cuts just as deep the other way. Let's say that some parents are all on board with designer babies. They're really excited about it, and they do everything they can to give their baby the best alleles, the best traits. All of these traits and alleles have to come from somewhere. These designer alleles can be harvested in two ways. They can either be made in a lab, or they can be isolated and extracted from somebody who just naturally has that trait, like somebody who just naturally has thick, beautiful blonde hair or whatever. So once that trait is isolated, it'll be replicated and then sold to whoever wants it, and it'll be implanted into their embryo or implanted into the germline in their gonads, whatever process they want. But the issue here is that these alleles aren't the parents. These are somebody else's alleles. They're alleles from outside of the reproductive lineage. And so the more designer alleles that you implant into your child, the less that child is your own, the less they are genetically related to you. If you take this to an extreme, and you consider the embryo's genome to be a Theseus's ship of sorts, and you replace every single part of the genome with some designer allele that's optimized, that's not your kid. The kid that's born from that embryo, that even though you produced that embryo, you and your spouse produced that embryo, that's not your kid, because you replaced all of those alleles with designer alleles. None of those alleles are yours. That kid will have no shared traits from you. And so there you have another very deep ethical shade of gray. These questions and their implications are what lead some people to fear that there's going to be a rapid adoption of designer baby technology, and this will very quickly stratify society along socioeconomic lines. As only the wealthy can afford the procedure at first, only wealthy families will produce designer babies. And because designed people will outcompete natural people, this will lead to a self-reinforcing feedback cycle that perpetually divides and stratifies society. Virtually every piece of science fiction that explores this problem predicts that it will cause massive social unrest and possibly even violence. It would be in the best interests of the natural people to kill all the designer people, so as to remove them as a threat from within the gene pool before it even begins. But obviously, then again, you run into serious ethical problems because you're killing people. Obviously, we would want to avoid this outcome. It might seem that in every scenario, the designer people win and take home all the money, and the natural people keep losing because they're at a literal genetic disadvantage. This assumption is not true, because the designer people will certainly have many problems of their own. In any scenario where there's designer babies growing into designer adults and society becomes stratified along genetic lines, the designer people are always at risk of a violent uprising from the natural people. The natural people would feel increasingly dispossessed and marginalized in the wake of what society has become. In many cases, there are valid arguments to be made that these genetically discriminated against natural people were acting in self-defense when they rose up and attacked the designer people. The designer people would have a legitimate defense when they said, "Hey, we didn't have a choice in how our parents designed us." That's a legitimate defense because that's true. But then there's a legitimate criticism that could be made if those designer people continued the cycle by genetically designing their own kids. And in a manner of speaking, they would do that by default, by handing down the alleles that were implanted in them as embryos. And they wouldn't have any control over that. They would only have control over whether they decided to add new traits or a new designer alleles and make the problem worse, so to speak. I can see the ethical argument being made that would demand that genetically designed people abstain from reproduction so as to prevent the establishment of designer lineages and the societal legacy of genetic discrimination. Just nip it in the bud. But going about enforcing something like that, where you force designed people to abstain from reproduction when they individually had no control over the fact that they were designed in the first place, that was their parents. This runs into really murky ethical territory really quickly. But there's also a genetic risk that we have to address. If designer babies become common and designed alleles are all over the market, there will be a natural competition for the best alleles, the best intelligence alleles, the best skin and gum health alleles, the best heart health alleles, everything. The best products, the best few alleles will outcompete the rest, and before you know it, we'll have just 1 or 2 or maybe 3 designed alleles that are being sold for each category, for each gene trait. Say there's a bunch of alleles that promote heart health, but one of them, after a couple generations, is conclusively proven to be the best. Well, after a while, that'll be the only heart health allele that anyone's gonna buy. The same thing's gonna go for, your liver health allele, your gut inflammation regulation alleles. Anything that can be commercialized in this way, you're gonna have capitalist competition. And the best one is gonna be the one that remains. And that best allele, the one that remains, is gonna be the one that everyone uses. Because this will be the stuff that's just available. Anybody who gets a designer baby will virtually always be taking a copy from a small gene pool that everybody else is swimming in. These alleles will become really common, almost as common as designer people in the first place. Genetic diversity will decrease dramatically as Walmart and Monsanto brand alleles replace everything else. The population of designer people will find themselves to be increasingly genetically homogeneous. They'll all have a handful of shared traits. They'll notice uncanny similarities between each other, and they'll all viscerally experience in themselves and in the other designer people that they meet the phenotypic outcomes of their parents' genotypic tinkering. This is kind of a fun thought to play around with. If the designer people began noticing all of their similarities from all their shared alleles sold as big-name products by all of the same pharmaceutical companies, how would they react to that? What would they think about it? I can see a spectrum of reactions. In the middle of the spectrum, you would have a neutral designer person who just doesn't care. The realization that they have this weird patchwork genetic relationship with all of these other designer people doesn't really affect them in a practical way, so they go about living their lives. But as we go towards one or the other end of the spectrum, the designer person starts to feel more extreme emotions. So say we go towards one end of the spectrum, where the designer person begins to feel stressed out, anxious, and confused about who they are. Maybe this deepens into an identity crisis, or the strange symptoms of depersonalization or derealization. And perhaps this ultimately leads to depression and suicide at the extreme end. Now, going back to the center, and then towards the other end of the spectrum, the designer person could feel a sense of community and pride. They could feel a sense of relatedness to the other designer people, like they were part of a big family of sorts. This could escalate into social groups, and then political movements, and then maybe even religions. At this extreme end, there could be some radicalized designed person fighting for the supremacy of designed people. Or even worse, there could be a designed person who hates non-designed people, and ironically dehumanizes them and wants to antagonize and fight against them. We saw what happened when some people developed this extreme attitude in the early to mid-20th century, and I don't need to re-describe all of the atrocities that happened as a result. So to summarize parts 1, 2, and 3, social Darwinism and eugenics are extremely controversial because they've been directly involved in some of the worst suffering and cruelty in the modern era. The problematic nature of social Darwinism and eugenics, I think, stems from fundamental flaws. As I've thoroughly explained, social Darwinism and eugenics are not based on science, and where they claim to be, they're virtually always misinterpreting and misunderstanding the science. But there's another problem, which is that social Darwinism is cruel, and eugenics is very difficult to do in a way that isn't blatantly unethical. We have not yet discovered a way to apply these social Darwinian principles to our societies in a way that doesn't violate human rights, or in a way that doesn't increase division, social stratification, and inequality. Many people, myself included, are inclined to think that it's fundamentally impossible to create a free, ethical society that respects human rights while also engaging in eugenics and social Darwinian policies. I think that fundamentally it's impossible because you're trying to reconcile two irreconcilable things. Evolution has forged humans to be social creatures. Our societies work best when we cooperate, when we work together with a sense of community and altruism, and when we show love and compassion for each other, including the most vulnerable and impoverished among us. Social Darwinian policies just hurt us and drive division between our societies, and the dream of eugenics is an infantile dream of trying to control chaos that will only end in horror and death. Now, no one can say ever again that evolution is synonymous with social Darwinism and eugenics.